Yorkshire, 1815. November brought with it the biting howl of the wind that marked the beginning of the long isolation on the moors. For most families in the valley, it was a season of hearth fires, roasted chestnuts, and the comfort of locked doors against the coming snow. For Clara Thorne, it marked the beginning of her third winter of silent vigilance. The interior of the shepherd's cottage flickered with the dying light of a single tallow candle, casting long shadows against the rough-hewn stone and the meagre possessions they had left. Clara sat with practised stillness near the hearth. Her coarse woolen dress was a deliberate disguise that blended into the gloom of the room. Her hands were resting protectively on her lap, her calloused fingers occasionally brushing the hair from the forehead of the sleeping child beside her, a boy she had guarded fiercely since the day the world believed his father died. "Mamma, is the storm angry?" asked Leo, a sleepy voice from the shadows, the 2-year-old heir who had never known a life outside these walls. "No, my love," Clara replied with a soft steadiness that did not reach her terrified heart. "We are quite safe." Safety was a lie she had perfected. If you love tales of passion and courage, please subscribe. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to know how far these stories travel. The daughter of a viscount, whose name had been scoured from society papers 3 years ago, Clara had become the embodiment of a ghost. At 24, she was considered a tragic widow, a fate sealed not by a body to bury, but by a letter from the War Office and the predatory ambition of her husband's cousin, Julian. Julian, who currently sat in the velvet chairs of Rossenhall, drinking the wine that should have been Arthur's. Across the room, the heavy iron latch of the door lifted with a metallic groan that cut through the sound of the gale. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was not the wind did not possess thumbs. She reached for the heavy iron poker by the hearth, her movements fluid with the instinct of a mother wolf. The door swung inward, bringing with it a spray of freezing rain and the scent of ozone and mud. A man stood in the threshold, a silhouette so massive he seemed to block out the night itself. He did not move like a traveller seeking shelter. He stood with the rigid tension of a soldier expecting an ambush. Clara rose on unsteady legs, the poker trembling in her grip. "We have nothing of value," she warned, her voice sharper than she felt. "Leave us be." The stranger stepped into the firelight and the poker clattered from her numb fingers to the stone floor. It was Arthur. But it was not the Arthur who had left her with a shy smile and a proxy marriage certificate 3 years ago. This man was carved from granite and grief. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his sodden greatcoat. His eyes, once the colour of a summer sky, were now the grey of a winter storm. "Clara," he rasped, his voice deep, roughened by smoke and command. It wasn't a question, but an acknowledgement of survival. Before she could find the breath to answer, a small movement at her skirts drew the giant's gaze downward. Leo, awakened by the clatter, peeked out from the folds of Clara's wool dress. The boy stared up at the intruder with wide, fearful eyes that mirrored the man's own. Arthur went still, the violence in his posture draining away to be replaced by a terrifying shock. He looked from the boy to Clara, the realization hitting him with the force of a cannonball. He had returned for a wife, but he was looking at an heir. Leo shrank back, burying his face in Clara's apron, terrified by the scarred titan who loomed over them like a judgment. "He has your eyes," Clara whispered, the silence stretching taut between them until it threatened to snap. "And your chin." Arthur dragged his gaze away from the child, a muscle feathering in his jaw as if the sight caused him physical pain. He turned his back to them, moving toward the small frosted window to peer out into the darkness. "I did not know," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "I was told you had fled, vanished. I assumed you had found a better life than waiting for a corpse." A corpse is what they told me you were, Clara countered, her protective hand still resting on Leo's head. They said you fell at Salamanca, that there was nothing left to bury. Arthur let out a short, harsh sound that might have been a laugh in another life. Convenient. I was not dead, Clara, merely detained in a French fortress that makes Newgate look like a palace. I spent 3 years rotting in damp straw, listening to men scream, keeping myself sane by remembering the colour of the dress you wore the day we married. The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Clara felt a fissure in her defences. Arthur! He spun around, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of cold command. But I am not the man who left, and we do not have time for sentiment. Julian believes I am dead. He believes you are gone, and in 3 days he intends to petition the Crown to have me declared legally deceased so he can assume the dukedom. Clara gasped. He cannot, the entailment. Julian cares nothing for the law unless he can twist it, Arthur interrupted, pacing the small room, his large frame making the cottage feel like a cage. He has already stripped the estate of its assets. If he takes the title, he will sell the land, evict the tenants, and burn the legacy my father built. And if he finds you and the boy here, unprotected... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara pulled Leo closer. She knew Julian's cruelty. It was why she had run. We leave tonight, Arthur stated, his tone brooking no argument. He looked at the meagre pile of belongings near the hearth. Pack only what is essential. Everything else can be replaced. Tonight? Clara protested, looking at the raging storm outside. Arthur, look at him. He is a child. We cannot drag him out into this tempest. The storm outside is nothing compared to what awaits us at Rossenhall, Arthur said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over them. He reached out, his gloved finger hovering inches from Leo's face before withdrawing, as if afraid he might contaminate the boy with his violence. Julian is holding a hunt tomorrow. The house is full of witnesses. We must arrive before dawn. We must present an heir before he can secure the title. He met Clara's gaze, his eyes hard as flint. You wanted to protect him, then bring him home. If we stay here, we are prey. At Rossenhall, I am the predator. Rossenhall did not welcome them. It endured them. The carriage, a hired hackney that smelled of wet straw and old leather, shuddered to a halt before the massive stone steps just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the storm clouds. Clara peered out, her heart sinking. The estate, once the jewel of the county, looked like a carcass picked clean. Weeds choked the gravel drive, ivy strangled the stonework, and the windows stared back like empty, soulless eyes. He has wasted no time, Arthur growled low in his throat, stepping out first. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a shield, placing his massive body between the biting wind and the carriage door as Clara descended with Leo wrapped tightly in her shawl. The great oak doors were locked, but Arthur pounded with a fist that demanded entry, not permission. It took minutes before a groggy footman cracked the door. The servant's eyes went wide, his face draining of colour as if he was staring at a revenant. He stumbled back, dropping his candle, allowing the wind, and the Duke, to sweep into the entrance hall. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of beeswax, damp wool, and the sour tang of spilled wine. The grand entrance hall was in disarray, muddy boots scattered on the marble and a priceless tapestry torn from its rod, lying in a heap in the corner. "Who is it? Jenkins?" a voice drawled from the shadows of the grand staircase. Julian. He descended slowly, a glass of brandy in hand despite the early hour, wearing a silk dressing gown that likely cost more than Clara's cottage. "I gave specific instructions that no beggars were to be—" He stopped on the bottom step. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The amber liquid pooled like blood. "Hello, Julian," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly so. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." Julian's face twisted, fear warring with fury. He looked thinner than Clara remembered, his features sharpened by greed and dissipation. "It's not possible," he stammered, his gaze darting to the jagged scar on Arthur's face. "The report. Salamanca. You were dead." "A mistake I have returned to correct." Arthur stepped forward, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the silence. "And I have brought my wife, and my son." At the word son, Julian's eyes snapped to Clara. The hatred in his gaze was so visceral it made her knees weak. He didn't see family, he saw an obstacle to his inheritance. He saw a target. Clara tightened her grip on the sleeping boy. She looked at Arthur, rigid, scarred, standing alone against the man who had wished him dead. And in that moment the fear of her husband evaporated, replaced by a cold clarity. Arthur was a stranger, yes, and perhaps broken by war, but in this house of vipers he was the only wall standing between her son and the wolves. They were no longer just a convenient match. They were a siege line. The nursery was the only room in Rossenhall where the chill of the stone walls did not seem to penetrate, warmed by a roaring fire and the clutter of a childhood Leo had brought with him from the cottage. Yet Arthur looked as out of place here as a cannon on a dining table. He stood by the window, his large frame blocking the light, watching his son play on the rug with the intense scrutiny of a sentry guarding a border. Leo sat amidst a pile of wooden blocks, his small hands stacking them with intense concentration. He glanced up, saw his father's scarred face and brooding posture, and immediately knocked the tower over, scrambling backward until his back hit the sofa. Arthur flinched as if struck. He took a hesitant step forward, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small painted tin soldier he had found in an old trunk. I brought you this," he offered, his voice a low rumble that sounded too much like thunder. He thrust the toy out, his movements jerky and sharp. Leo whimpered, burying his face in a cushion. "Monster," he mumbled into the fabric. The word drained the blood from Arthur's face. He set the soldier down on the table with a heavy clack and turned to leave. "It is no use," he muttered to Clara, who sat mending a shirt by the fire. "I am a creature of siege and slaughter, Clara. I have no business in a nursery." "Stop," Clara said, setting aside her needlework. She stood and moved to him, placing a hand on his forearm. The muscle beneath the sleeve was rock hard, tense with self-loathing. "You are terrifying him because you are looming over him like a thunderstorm. You are a duke, Arthur, but to him you are just a very large stranger." "I don't know how to be anything else," he confessed, looking down at his hands that were scarred, calloused, and lethal. "These hands have strangled men in the mud of Vittoria. They know how to break, how to crush. I am terrified that if I touch him, I will shatter him." "Then don't touch him yet," Clara said softly. "Just be with him." She tugged on his arm. "Sit on the floor." Arthur looked at the rug as if it were a field of caltrops, but he lowered his massive frame until he was sitting cross-legged, his knees nearly touching his chin. The change in perspective was immediate. He was no longer a Titan. He was just a man. Clara sat beside him and picked up a wooden block. "Leo needs a wall for his castle," she announced to the room, ignoring the boy's wariness. She handed the block to Arthur. "A strong wall." Arthur took the wood, his fingers trembling slightly. He placed it gently on the carpet, then another. Slowly, curiously, Leo peeked out from the cushion. Seeing the monster reduced to a pile of limbs on the floor, stacking wood with painstaking care, the boy crept forward. He picked up a block and placed it atop Arthur's. Arthur stopped breathing. He looked at Clara, panic and wonder warring in his eyes. "Breathe," she whispered. "He is not glass, and you are not a hammer." For the first time since his return, the War Duke exhaled. The poison in Rossenhall did not come in a vial. It was served with a smile and a glass of sherry. Julian moved through the house like a damp chill, finding Arthur alone in the billiards room, the clicking of ivory balls, the only sound in the heavy silence. "He is a fine boy," Julian observed, swirling his drink, leaning casually against the table. "Though one cannot help but notice he lacks the Aldridge nose, and his hair is rather fair, isn't it? Much like that stable hand Clara was so fond of. Directing before you left." Arthur gripped his cue until the wood groaned. "Clara is honourable." "Of course," Julian soothed, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "But 3 years is a lifetime, cousin. A woman alone, destitute, frightened. She seeks comfort where she can find it. No one would blame her for ensuring her survival or her pleasure. Are you truly certain the boy is yours? Or are you simply so desperate for a legacy that you will accept another man's leavings?" Arthur said nothing, but the cue snapped in his hands with a violence that made Julian flinch. The seed was planted. Arthur looked at his reflection in the dark window, scarred, broken, a ghost, and wondered why a woman like Clara would remain faithful to a memory when she could have had a man of flesh and blood. An hour later, Julian found Clara in the conservatory, deadheading the neglected roses with savage snips. "He seems settling in well," Julian noted, watching her. "Though I worry for you, my dear. Arthur is changed. The War Department had him listed as unstable before his capture. Men like that, they obsess over bloodlines." Clara kept cutting, though her hand faltered. "Arthur wants his family." "Arthur wants an heir," Julian corrected softly. "He needs the boy to secure the title against my claim. But a wife? A wife who saw him before he was a monster? That is a reminder he does not need. I heard him speaking with his solicitor about the convent in Cornwall, a quiet place for troubled women. Once Leo is legally recognised, you become surplus." That evening dinner was a silent battlefield. The long mahogany table stretched between them like a vast frozen wasteland. Arthur watched Clara over the rim of his wineglass, searching for signs of deceit, wondering whose hands had touched her while he rotted in a cell. Clara watched Arthur, seeing not the father who had stacked blocks on the floor, but the soldier who viewed her as a tactical necessity, a vessel to be discarded once the objective was secured. "Is the soup to your liking?" Clara asked, the sound of her own voice startling her. "It is adequate," Arthur replied, his voice clipped and cold. They ate in silence, two strangers trapped in a web of lies, spun by a man smiling from the other end of the hall, neither brave enough to ask the question that would shatter the fragile truce of their marriage. The crisp November air bit at Clara's cheeks as she walked the perimeter of the ornamental lake, watching Leo chase a hoop along the path. It was the only place on the estate that felt open, free from the suffocating gloom of the house. Arthur walked 10 paces behind them, his greatcoat billowing, his eyes scanning the tree line with the ceaseless vigilance that had kept him alive in France. "Look, Papa, faster!" Leo shouted, his fear of the giant slowly eroding into curiosity. He laughed, the sound bright and jarring against the estate's silence. The hoop wobbled and veered off the gravel path, rolling on to the wooden footbridge that spanned the narrowest part of the water. The bridge was old, moss-slicked, but sturdy enough. Or it should have been. Leo ran on to the planks. "I'll get it!" A sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Clara screamed as the railing Leo leaned against simply gave way, the wood shearing off as if it had been sawn through. The boy tumbled backward, his small body hitting the freezing black water with a terrifying splash. "Leo!" Clara lunged forward, but a dark blur slammed past her. Arthur didn't run. He exploded into motion. He didn't bother with the bridge. He vaulted the bank, crashing into the icy water without a second of hesitation. The water was deep here, choked with reeds and mud. Clara reached the edge, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, scanning the surface where ripples spread in widening circles. "Please," she sobbed, the word a prayer and a plea. "Please." The surface erupted. Arthur surged up, gasping, holding Leo high against his chest like a precious shield. The boy was coughing, sputtering water, wailing in terror, but alive. Arthur waded to the bank, fighting the sucking mud, his face a mask of ferocious determination. He climbed out and collapsed onto the frozen grass, clutching the shivering boy to his sodden coat. Clara fell to her knees beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them, heedless of the freezing water soaking her dress. "I have him!" Arthur gasped, his teeth chattering, his eyes wild. "I have him, Clara. He's safe." "You saved him," she wept, pressing her forehead against Arthur's wet shoulder. She looked at the bridge, at the clean, fresh saw marks on the broken timber. "It wasn't an accident." Arthur followed her gaze. The ferocity in his eyes shifted from panic to a cold, lethal rage. He looked down at Clara, seeing her fierce love, her terror, and realized with a jolt that she was not conspiring against him. She was the only other person in this world who would bleed for this boy. "He tried to kill my son," Arthur whispered, the realization shattering the last of his doubts about Clara's loyalty. He reached out, his hand shaking from cold and adrenaline, and cupped Clara's face. His thumb brushed away a tear. "I will burn this world to ash before I let him touch either of you again." For the first time, Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, finding anchor in his strength. In the freezing mud, amidst the ruin of a sabotage, the wall between them crumbled. They were no longer a duke and a duchess playing roles. They were parents, united by a terrifying love and a common enemy. The announcement of the Rossenhall ball was less an invitation and more a declaration of war. Parchment envelopes sealed with the ducal crest were dispatched to every influential family in the county. The message was clear. The Duke lives. The heir is legitimate. Come and see. In the cavernous ballroom, dusted off and lit by 1,000 candles for the first time in years, the air was thick with tension. A small orchestra, hired from York, played a tentative melody as Arthur and Clara stood in the centre of the polished floor. "We must be perfect," Arthur murmured, adjusting his cuffs. He wore his formal evening attire, the black velvet absorbing the light, the jagged scar on his face stark against the white cravat. "If we stumble, if we look like strangers, Julian wins. The whispers will start before the first dance ends." "I know the steps, Arthur," Clara said, smoothing the silk of her emerald gown, a colour he had chosen because he remembered it matched her eyes. "Do you?" "I haven't danced in 4 years," he admitted, offering his hand. "I've spent more time dodging bayonets than navigating a waltz." She placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, rough, and engulfing. As he pulled her into position, the distance between them vanished. His hand settled on her waist, firm, possessive, yet careful, as if she were made of porcelain. The music swelled. They moved. It was stiff at first, a negotiation of space and rhythm, but as the beat took hold, the muscle memory of their youth returned. They had danced once before, the night they met, a lifetime ago, before the war, before the scar, before the secrets. "You are leading with your shoulder," Clara whispered, looking up at him. "Relax, you are not marching into battle." "With you it feels the same," he replied, his gaze locked on hers. "Terrifying." Clara laughed softly, a genuine sound that seemed to startle the shadows in the room. Arthur's expression softened. He spun her, pulling her back flush against his chest. The smell of him, soap, starch, and the faint woodsy scent of the man beneath the soldier filled her senses. For a moment the ballroom emptied. There was no Julian, no Leo, no looming threat. There was only the heat of his hand on her back and the way his eyes tracked the curve of her lips. "Clara," he breathed, his voice dropping to that rough timbre that made her shiver. He stopped dancing, though the music played on. He lowered his head, his lips hovering inches from hers. The air between them crackled, charged with the electricity of 3 years of longing and fear. She tilted her chin up, her breath hitching. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to know if the husband she had mourned was truly back. "Your Grace," a servant's voice shattered the spell. "The guests are arriving." Arthur pulled back sharply, the mask of the Duke slamming back into place. But as he offered her his arm to face the lions at the gate, Clara saw his hand tremble. The soldier was ready for war, but the man was undeniably, irrevocably falling in love with his wife. The ballroom was a sea of silks, jewels, and judgment. Every eye in the room was fixed on the pair standing on the dais, the scarred Duke who had risen from the grave and the reclusive Duchess who had hidden his heir. They stood, united, Arthur's hand resting protectively on Clara's lower back as the murmur of gossip buzzed like a hive of angry bees. Julian waited until the music stopped for the supper interval. He stepped into the centre of the floor holding a sheaf of papers, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "My lords, ladies," Julian's voice carried effortlessly to the vaulted ceiling, "a toast to the miraculous return of my cousin, and to his charming family." He turned to Arthur, his eyes glinting with malice. "Though in the spirit of truth that tonight represents, I feel it is my duty to clear the air regarding the young heir's provenance." The room went deathly silent. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Arthur went rigid beside her, a statue of coiled violence. "I hold here a letter," Julian continued, waving the parchment like a flag, "dated 3 years ago, from a stable master in the village. It details a most passionate affair with a certain lonely lady of the manor, while her husband was indisposed." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "It pains me to say it, but the boy, Leo, cannot be the blood of Rossenhall. He is a bastard foisted upon a grieving family to steal a title." Clara stepped forward, her hands shaking. "That is a lie! A forgery!" "Is it?" Julian sneered. "Can you prove your husband was in your bed when the boy was conceived, Clara? He was in Spain." Arthur moved. He didn't shout, he didn't draw a sword. He walked down the steps of the dais with a slow, terrifying deliberation. The crowd parted instantly. He reached Julian and snatched the papers from his hand. He didn't even look at them. He walked to the nearest candelabra and held the corner of the sheaf to the flame. "Arthur!" Julian cried, lunging forward, but he was blocked by the sheer force of Arthur's glare. "Let it burn," Arthur said, his voice calm, carrying to every corner of the room, "because ink on paper does not make a father. Love makes a father. Duty makes a father." He turned to the crowd, the burning papers curling into ash in his iron grip. "My cousin speaks of letters, he speaks of absence, but he forgets that I wrote to my wife every single day of my captivity. Over 1,000 letters, letters that spoke of the night before I left, the night my son was conceived." Arthur looked at Clara, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unhidden devotion. "I may have been thousands of miles away, but my heart never left this house. I know my son, I know his eyes, for they are my own. I know his spirit, for it is his mother's." He dropped the ashes onto the polished floor and stepped on them, grinding the lie into dust. "Clara Thorne is my wife. Leo Aldridge is my son and my heir, and any man who questions the honour of this duchess answers to me." He drew his dress sword, the steel singing in the silence, and drove the point into the floorboards at Julian's feet. "Get out of my house, Julian, before I forget that we share blood." The room erupted, not in scandal but in awe. Julian, pale and defeated, scrambled back from the steel and the man who wielded it. Clara looked at her husband, tears streaming down her face, realizing that the War Duke had just fought his greatest battle, not with a cannon, but with the truth of his heart. The silence that fell over Rossenhall was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the tomb it had been upon their arrival. It was a clean silence, the kind that follows a fever breaking. Julian was gone, escorted off the grounds by the very guards he had tried to bribe, vanishing into the snowy night like a bad dream. Arthur stood by the nursery window, the moonlight softening the harsh planes of his face. He was watching Leo sleep, his hand resting on the railing of the cot, no longer afraid that his touch would shatter the boy. The tension that had held his shoulders near his ears for 3 years had finally dissolved. Clara approached him slowly, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound in the room. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. He didn't flinch. He turned his palm up and interlaced their fingers. "You were magnificent tonight," she whispered. Arthur shook his head, looking down at her with a vulnerability that stole the breath from her lungs. "I was terrified. Charging a French battery was easier than standing in that room and fearing they would take you from me." "They couldn't," Clara said fiercely. "We are Rossenhall." Arthur turned fully toward her, his other hand coming up to trace the line of her jaw. "The letters," he murmured. "I did write them. In my head, on the walls of my cell, in the dirt of the prison yard. I wrote to you every hour. I told you about the cold, the hunger, the fear, but mostly I told you that I was coming home." His thumb brushed her lower lip. "I didn't survive the war because I was a soldier, Clara. I survived because I dreamed of this moment. I dreamed of a son I hadn't met and a wife I hadn't cherished enough when I had the chance." Clara felt the tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of release. "The War Duke," she said softly, touching the scar on his cheek. "Is he gone?" Arthur closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. "He died in the ballroom tonight. The man who stands before you is just Arthur. Ideally, a husband. Hopefully, a father." "Arthur is enough," she breathed. "He is everything." He kissed her then, not for show, not for duty, and not for an heir. He kissed her with the slow, burning reverence of a man who had walked through hell to find his heaven. It was a promise sealed in the moonlight. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the dark moors in pristine white, covering the scars of the land. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, watching over a family that had been broken, besieged, and finally, miraculously, made whole. The end.